actually she's still missing. After that, I want to show what happened. And they evacuated, they escaped to roof of top of the roof of this building, disaster management center. And you can see smoke. You cannot see tsunami. Tsunami attacked and destroyed houses and buildings. Just smoke we can see. And 20 or 30 kilometers height, 20 or 30 kilometers per hour speed is coming. And on the foot, immediately not way. And the last time, it's a three-story buildings, but on the top of the roof, a tsunami attack. And how's hazard map? Local government prepared hazard map. This was on. They prepared this hazard map for local municipalities and they distributed. And this colored area is a risk area. It's 50 to 100 or 200 meters. But actual tsunami came here, this pink dot. It's a 3 kilometers. Because, as I said, our government predicted smaller tsunami and smaller earthquake. This hazard map also could not show real risk area. They prepared evacuation. We Japanese are always doing such exercises. In JICA headquarters in Tokyo, every year we are doing evacuation exercise. If you work in Tokyo, you have to do embassy or anything. And this is the success story. In Fukushima City, 3,000 students safely evacuated because of disaster management education. They were instructed never stick to original plan. Do your best. Always escape higher places, even a little. And read evacuation. Never wait instruction. You have to start by yourself evacuation. How's ordinary people? 1/3 of people did not evacuate immediately. Why? They are searching for their families. They never think tsunami is higher than that. And last time, they were safe. Some evacuation centers were flooded, I find. And lastly, community responding. Community, we have a volunteer-based firefighting groups. We say show border. I believe in US you have similar. What they did conduct, or they did fought against tsunami also this time. They closed sea gate, they led evacuation, they monitor tsunami on the sea. This is at the risk of their life. Actually, 250 members are still missing, were dead or still missing. Okay, so as I explained, vulnerability was increased for the last 100 years. Resettlement worked somehow. And the countermeasures against earthquakes, well, I can say perfectly work. And disaster management at school is also one. However, technologies not perfectly function somehow, predicted, and utilize some hazard map and warning, but not perfectly work. The question would be how we can improve this area. Our government is starting improving their technology. Higher dikes, stronger dikes, or resilient dikes, or precise early warning, or it's necessary. But I would raise one issue. The most important point is people. People decide evacuation or escape by themselves through utilizing early warning. People must know limitation of our technology. Tsunami dikes never perfect. And sometimes warning system cannot work function well. People must know it. In other words, I should say from engineering oriented to people oriented. Or supply driven to demand-driven, people's demand. And structure-based to integrating community-based. Okay, yeah, so this is my last one. Just I'd like to emphasize these government efforts currently is going well and definitely necessary. But last point, put people at the center of disaster management system. I'd like to point out this one. Thank you very much. I found swimming that flag. This is Japanese flag. And parents play children's health and grow up. I found this flag in Ikuzen Takata, the most devastated city. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to stay here so we can see. I'm Jennifer Scleroux, and prior to the series of nuclear accidents that started in the 1990s, I actually worked for DONIN, the Japan Nuclear Fuel Cycle Development Institute. And after that, I worked for the Commerce Department in the Office of Japan for a long time. And my work included electricity deregulation in Japan. And during that time, I spent 1 year as a Mike Mansfield Fellow in Tokyo, working at various Japanese agencies, MEDI, the Cabinet Office, the Foreign Ministry, and a Diet member's office as well, working on trade issues, but also a little bit on energy issues. And I'm currently writing my dissertation at George Mason University on the relationship between governance structures and focusing events like the earthquake and the tsunami and the impact it can have or not have on energy policy and potential changes to energy policy. So, actually you can go back to the beginning for a second. Since March 11th, there's been much controversy, as I'm sure you've all seen in the press, on the various mechanics and the location of the nuclear reactors, Japan's electricity grid, backup generators, spent fuel storage. And I wanted to actually take a step back from all of that and look at the underlying foundations behind Japan's energy policy process and a little bit of their governance system and what that might mean for their energy policy and the implications of the March 11th disaster and potential future solutions and countermeasures. Thank you. So I wanted to look at some frameworks for understanding the energy policy process, actual features of the energy policy process, and then fallout from the earthquake and the tsunami. Sorry, pun intended. And I wanted to look at 3 frameworks. Those are priorities, relationships, and risk perceptions. Okay, thank you. So many of you are probably familiar with Japan's energy policy, the 3 E's: energy security, environmental protection, and economic growth. But one way in which this is relevant to our discussion today is that nuclear power actually plays a role in all 3 as a result of this policy. So starting with the 1970s oil shocks, energy security became equivalent with nuclear power. For the most part, that was the largest portion of the Japanese plan for how to maintain energy security. Environmental protection, the Kyoto Protocol came, and Japan already had its nuclear power plan in place. So they were not necessarily set, but they had a pretty good idea of how they were going to meet potential targets because the nuclear power plant expansion was going to help largely with that. They did have some plans for renewables and, of course, energy efficiency, but nuclear power was going to underlie the second pillar as well. The third pillar, economic growth, sounds on the face of it like it might not be completely relevant to the first 2, but the way in which it was presented when I was at the Commerce Department is that it actually means utilization of market mechanisms, which is a euphemism for deregulation. So that third pillar really became more prominent during the discussions with the Japanese about deregulation of their utilities because they wanted to ensure that energy security and environmental protection became first and second in those 3 pillars, and economic growth would stay third, not because they didn't support economic growth, but because they didn't want anything to compromise the investments that the utilities had already made in nuclear power. So while all 3 pillars were considered to somewhat be equally important, the phrasing, I believe, was something to the effect of, in coordination with the first 2 policies, pursue economic growth. So that's this policy becomes important as we start to look at what their current energy policy is and where they might go. The second framework, if you consider the 3 E's in the context of relationships in Japan on the energy policy process, there are of course more sectors and subsectors, but broadly, the government, the public, private sector, and the media. And I just wanted to talk just briefly about some of the interrelationships between these groups. So within the bureaucracy, within the government, and then within the bureaucracy, you have overlapping oversight. You have METI and you have MEX. And then you also have the Cabinet Office. And some of the areas that they cover involve overlapping energy interests. And then that said, there are no completely independent regulators, which became prominent in the press after everyone started looking at who was regulating the power plants. And then between the bureaucracy and the Diet, so still within the government, the bureaucracy typically has written laws. Lower level bureaucrats serve as the staff for the Diet members because they don't actually have a large amount of staff like our congressional members do here. Diet members also serve as bureaucrats at the top levels. So you have a lot of interrelationships coming to play, and then you have the 3 E's and nuclear power in the background. And then the parties, there's been a lot of play, I think, in the press about the different, about the 2 political parties, the opposition and the majority party. My impression when I was working in government, in the bureaucracy in Japan, and then in the Diet, is really there wasn't as great a differentiation between the parties as there might seem. There were pro-nuclear people in both parties. There were anti-nuclear people in both parties. There were people in one party who actually wanted to run under the other party, but there was no room, so they ran in the opposition and won. So there's the distinctions that I see in the press, I don't actually see as much in practice. And then the current situation with the government is that there is a fracturing between the DPJ and the bureaucracy, and that's come into play in the press as well. But I also saw that actually when I was in Tokyo, Prime Minister Koizumi was in power at that point, and he made an effort to create his own mechanisms to accomplish things. But he wasn't dealing with a crisis, so he wasn't trying to do that during the time of a crisis when he actually probably would have needed to galvanize the bureaucracy. And that, I think, is probably the difference between the 2 scenarios, is that the current Prime Minister is trying to create his own mechanisms at a time when maybe that isn't the best thing to do, because you actually need to rely on people who've been in the government for a long time and that might have knowledge that you don't have. And then if we move to the government-private sector relationship, we have, I think, some stereotypes here about how the government-private sector relationship works in Japan, but much as here, retired industry executives can go into government. Retired government people can go into industry. So there's a revolving door, but that happens here as well. And then as a result of all of that, the government policies and goals, because you have overlapping jurisdictions within the government, and then you have the government-industry relationship, and it's many, many different industries that have relationships with the government, you end up with overlapping and conflicting goals in addition to the policies. The underlying goals can be different. And then you have the government-public relationship, which I think has played a really large role in the way this crisis has played out, because I call it the Spider-Man theory. With great power comes great responsibility. The Japanese public is willing to see some level of freedom of choice, not democracy choice, but in terms of the amount of flexibility they may have to do things, on the assumption that the government is going to handle their safety and their security. So the government takes responsibility for decisions that people might otherwise have made. I'll just give a few, well, one primary example, which is not energy related, but when I was in Tokyo, the mad cow disease problem emerged. And the public's response to government was, you should be deciding what's coming into this country. It is not our decision when we go to the store to figure out whether or not there's a problem with the product. The product should not even be in the country if there might be a problem with it. And I think potentially if you ask anyone in any country, would you like your government to allow tainted meat? The answer is no. But if you ask Americans, would you like the government to restrict products from coming in